My brother spent 6 months giving interviews, signing books, and accepting praise for a novel he had never written. Then a live television host asked him one question about his own book that he could not answer. His publisher suspended all sales the next morning, and he finally understood. Every lie he had built his career on collapsed in front of the entire country. My name is Nicole Hartwell, and what you are about to hear is the story of how my brother stole the most important thing I had ever created, how the truth refused to stay buried, and how one live television interview became the moment everything finally came apart. If this story hits close to home, subscribe and drop a like right now. It helps more people find stories like this one. Ethan is 4 years older than me. We grew up in a quiet neighborhood in Nashville, North Carolina, where our father ran a small accounting firm and our mother spent her evenings reading on the back porch with a stack of library books she cycled through faster than anyone I have ever known. That back porch was where I fell in love with stories. I started writing before I was 10, diary entries and short stories about people I invented, characters who felt more real to me than most of the ones I encountered at school. By high school, I had filled a dozen notebooks and started something longer, a story with chapters and structure, and a beginning I revised so many times the first page had its own history of crossed-out lines and margin notes. Ethan was different. He was the one who filled every room he walked into, the one who remembered everyone's name and made people feel good about themselves without seeming to try. He was popular in the easy, effortless way that some people simply are, and he moved through the world as if it had been arranged slightly in his favor. He had never once shown any interest in books, in writing, or in the quiet internal life that made those things possible. Growing up, I don't think I ever saw him finish a novel. After college, I moved to Portland and took a job as a copy editor at a small publishing house, which paid just enough to cover rent and left me enough evenings to keep working on the novel I had been building in my head for years. The idea had been with me since my early 20s, a psychological drama about a woman who discovers that the version of her life her family has been telling for decades is built entirely on a lie. I knew the emotional center of it better than I knew most things about myself, and I spent the first year just finding the right structure to hold everything the story needed to carry. Ethan was living in Nashville at the time, working in marketing. We talked on the phone every few weeks and saw each other at holidays. He knew I was writing something serious, but I kept the details close because the book felt too important and too unfinished to describe out loud. Some things lose something when you talk about them before they are ready. By the 4th year, the manuscript was complete in its first full draft, and I had spent another year revising it into something I genuinely believed in. I had worked with 3 beta readers, careful, trusted people who had given me detailed feedback across multiple drafts. Every version of the manuscript existed in a documented trail going back to the original outline I had written in a coffee shop in Portland 5 years before any of this happened. Ethan visited me that fall. He seemed genuinely curious about the book, asking questions about the story and the characters with an attention I wasn't used to from him. On his last evening before flying back to Nashville, he asked if he could read the manuscript. He said he wanted to understand what I had been working on for so long, that he was proud of me and wanted to see it. I printed him a copy and handed it to him at the door. He hugged me and said he couldn't wait to read it. I never imagined that the manuscript I handed my brother at my front door was the last time I would hold it as something that belonged only to me. 3 weeks after Ethan flew back to Nashville, he called me on a Sunday morning and asked how I was feeling about the manuscript. I told him I was still deciding whether to start querying literary agents or give it one more round of revisions first. He said the book was ready, that I was overthinking it the way I always had, and that I needed to trust what I had built. It was the most encouraging thing he had said to me in years, and I held on to it for longer than I probably should have. What I didn't know was that Ethan had already made a decision about the manuscript that had nothing to do with my timeline or my plans. Sometime in the weeks between leaving my apartment and making that Sunday phone call, he had contacted a literary agent in New York named Marcus Vane. Marcus ran a mid-size agency that specialized in literary fiction and psychological thrillers, exactly the category my book lived in. Ethan had found him through a former colleague in Nashville who had worked briefly in publishing, and he had sent Marcus a query letter along with the first 50 pages of my manuscript under his own name. I found out none of this on that Sunday call. Ethan kept the conversation light, asked about my job, mentioned he was thinking about making some changes in his own career, and said goodbye the same way he always did. I went back to my desk that afternoon and opened the manuscript file to read through the final chapter one more time, still weighing whether it was ready. It felt ready. I just couldn't bring myself to let it go yet. That hesitation cost me more than I understood at the time. Marcus Vane responded to Ethan's query within 10 days, which in the publishing world is almost unheard of. He requested the full manuscript immediately. Ethan sent it the same day. 3 weeks later, Marcus called Ethan and told him the book was one of the most compelling debut manuscripts he had read in several years, and that he wanted to represent it. Ethan signed with Marcus, without telling me a single word of what was happening. Over the following months, Marcus submitted the book to 11 major publishing houses. 4 of them expressed serious interest. 2 came back with offers. Ethan accepted a deal with a publisher based in New York for an advance that I only learned the size of much later, after everything had already collapsed. The contract listed Ethan Hartwell as the sole author. The acknowledgments page thanked his family in a single vague sentence that didn't mention me by name. During all of those months, Ethan and I kept talking on the phone the way we always had. He never mentioned the agent, the submissions, the offers, or the contract. He asked about my job, made me laugh the way only older siblings can, and occasionally circled back to ask whether I had started querying yet. Every time I said I was still deciding, he nodded along and changed the subject. Looking back, those conversations were the most deliberate thing he ever did, keeping me exactly where I was while the book moved further and further away from me. The first time I saw the cover was on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was on my lunch break, scrolling through a publishing industry newsletter I followed for work, and a new release announcement stopped me mid-scroll. The cover image was clean and striking, dark tones, a single figure, the kind of design that signals serious literary fiction. The title was the same title I had been using in my files for 3 years. The author name was Ethan Hartwell. The description in the announcement was a summary of my book, written in someone else's words, but describing my characters, my plot, my ending. I read it twice. Then I closed the newsletter, walked to the bathroom down the hall from my office, and stood at the sink for several minutes with the water running, trying to understand what I had just seen. By the time I walked back to my desk, I had already decided 2 things. I was not going to call Ethan that afternoon. And I was not going to do anything at all until I had spoken to someone who understood what this meant legally and what my options actually were. I opened my laptop, went to my documents folder, and looked at the original manuscript file. Created date, 5 years and 3 months ago. Last modified, 8 months ago. The final revision before I had printed the copy I handed to Ethan at my front door. Below it, a folder containing every draft going back to the first chapter one had ever written, every outline, every note, and 3 separate email threads with my beta readers that spanned nearly 2 years of detailed feedback and revision discussion. Everything was there. Every piece of it dated, documented, and sitting exactly where I had left it. Ethan had taken the manuscript. He had not taken the record of how it came to exist. The attorney's name was Sandra Cho, and a colleague at the publishing house where I worked had mentioned her name once in passing as someone who handled intellectual property disputes in the literary world specifically. I called her office the morning after I found the announcement and got an appointment for the following Tuesday. Those 4 days were the longest I had spent sitting still in years. I didn't contact Ethan. I didn't tell my parents. I went to work, came home each evening, and organized every file I had into a folder structure Sandra could move through quickly when we met. She was in her mid-40s, precise and unhurried, the kind of person who listens to everything before responding to anything. I laid out the full timeline from the beginning, when I started writing, when the manuscript was completed, when Ethan visited, when I found the announcement. When I finished, she told me what she saw. The original files with creation dates, the full draft history, and 2 years of email correspondence with beta readers discussing specific scenes and characters was exactly the kind of evidence that established authorship in an intellectual property case. She told me the case was strong and that we should move carefully and quickly in that order. Sandra sent a formal legal notice to Marcus Vane's agency and to the publishing house. informing them that the manuscript published under Ethan Hartwell's name was the intellectual property of Nicole Hartwell and requesting an immediate suspension of all sales and promotional activity pending resolution of the dispute. The publishing house acknowledged receipt within a week. Marcus Vane's agency did not respond directly. Instead, Ethan called me. He called on a Wednesday evening and skipped the small talk entirely. He said the book would never have been published without his connections, that I had been sitting on the manuscript for years without doing anything with it, and that his involvement had turned something that might never have reached anyone into a book thousands of people were now reading. He said he deserved credit for that. I let him finish. Then I told him that submitting someone's work under a different name without their knowledge was not involvement, it was theft, and that Sandra would be in touch with his attorney. I ended the call. What I didn't tell him was that earlier that same day, one of my beta readers had messaged me out of nowhere. Her name was Priya, and she had read 2 full drafts of the manuscript over 18 months, leaving detailed notes on nearly every chapter. She had seen the book announcement through a friend in publishing and immediately recognized the title, the premise, and the description. When I confirmed what had happened, she said she would provide a full written statement describing her involvement, the dates of her feedback, and the specific content of our editorial discussions. Within the same week, both of my other beta readers contacted me independently after seeing the same announcement. All 3 provided Sandra with written statements and documentation of their correspondence with me going back nearly 2 years before the book was ever published. Ethan had taken the manuscript. He had not anticipated that the manuscript had a history existing entirely outside of him, in the memories and inboxes of people who had never met him and had no reason to protect him. Sandra filed the formal intellectual property claim the following Monday. By Wednesday, the publishing house had suspended all sales pending the outcome of the legal process. The book that had been climbing the bestseller charts went quiet almost overnight. And Ethan, who had spent months building a literary identity on top of my work, was about to face questions he had no way to answer. The suspension of sales did not stay quiet for long. Within days of the publishing house pulling the book from active distribution, industry newsletters started picking up the story. Publishing is a small world, and news about an authorship dispute involving a book that had been gaining serious momentum moved through it faster than either Ethan or Marcus Vane could manage. By the end of that first week, 2 literary blogs had published pieces asking questions about the situation, neither of them with full information, but both of them with enough to make people uncomfortable. Ethan hired an attorney in Nashville named Douglas Pierce, who had experience in contract disputes, but limited background in intellectual property litigation specifically. Douglas sent Sandra a response letter arguing that the manuscript Ethan had submitted represented a substantial creative collaboration between siblings, that Ethan had contributed significant editorial development to the work, and that the published version differed meaningfully from any draft Nicole had produced independently. It was the only argument available to them, and Sandra had anticipated it from the beginning. She responded with the documentation. Every draft of the manuscript going back 5 years. The original outline written before Ethan had ever read a single page. The beta reader correspondence containing detailed discussions of scenes, characters, and structural decisions that predated Ethan's involvement by years. And a side-by-side comparison prepared by a forensic literary analyst Sandra had worked with on previous cases, showing that the published text matched my final draft with a margin of difference so small it fell within normal copy editing range. Ethan had not rewritten the book. He had changed a handful of sentences and submitted the rest exactly as I had given it to him. Douglas Pierce went quiet for nearly 2 weeks after receiving Sandra's response package. During that time, Ethan stopped giving interviews. His social media, which had been active with literary content and promotional posts since the book launched, went completely silent. Marcus Vane released a brief statement through his agency saying they were cooperating fully with the publisher's internal review and had no further comment at that time. The statement answered nothing and satisfied no one. My parents called during that silence. My mother spoke first, carefully, the way she always did when she was trying to hold 2 things at once without dropping either of them. She said she loved both of us and that she hoped we could find a way to resolve things without destroying the family in the process. My father was quieter, but said something that landed harder. He suggested that, even if I was right about the writing, going to court was going to hurt everyone, and that maybe there was a middle ground worth considering. I told him there was no middle ground that involved my name not being on my own book. The call ended politely and changed nothing. What broke the silence publicly was not the legal process. It was a podcast. Ethan had recorded an interview 3 months earlier, before any of this had started, with a well-known literary podcast that focused on debut authors. The episode had been scheduled for release during what was supposed to be the height of the book's promotional run. The podcast host had not pulled the episode when the dispute became public, either because they hadn't followed the story closely enough or because the episode had already been committed to their release schedule. It went live on a Thursday morning while the legal process was still in its early stages. The host asked Ethan detailed questions about the book's origins, its central character, and the specific emotional experience that had inspired the story's core premise. Ethan's answers were smooth at first, general statements about the creative process, broad descriptions of the themes, the kind of language that sounds authoritative until someone who actually wrote the book is listening. I was listening. And the further the conversation went, the clearer it became that Ethan was describing my book the way someone describes a movie they saw once rather than a world they had built themselves. When the host asked about a specific subplot in the second half of the book, a quietly devastating sequence involving the protagonist's relationship with her grandmother that I had revised more times than any other section and considered the emotional heart of the entire story, Ethan paused for slightly too long before giving an answer that described the subplot accurately, but without any of the specificity that comes from having made the choices that put it there. He knew what happened. He didn't know why those particular decisions had been made, because he hadn't made them, and I had never explained them to him. Sandra flagged the episode immediately and added a transcript to the case file. It was not legal evidence in a formal sense, but it was a public record of Ethan being unable to speak with genuine authority about the interior of a book he had claimed to spend years writing. Combined with everything else already documented, it painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult for anyone to look at and interpret generously. The publishing house's legal team contacted Sandra the following week and requested a meeting. They had completed their internal review and were ready to discuss next steps. Douglas Pierce had not filed any new responses in 18 days. Ethan had not made a public statement in nearly a month. The momentum that had been building in his direction since the book launched had reversed completely, and everyone involved could feel it moving. The meeting with the publishing house took place on a Monday morning via video call. Sandra represented me while their legal team, consisting of 3 attorneys and the publisher's editorial director, joined from their New York office. The editorial director was a woman named Claire Sutton who had championed the book internally from the beginning and had been the one to push the acquisition through. She looked tired in a way that suggested she had been living with this situation for weeks and was ready for it to be over. Claire spoke first. She said the internal review had been thorough and that the documentation Sandra had submitted was impossible to dismiss. The manuscript's development history, the beta reader statements, and the forensic literary analysis collectively established a timeline that the publishing house could not in good conscience ignore. She said the company had built its reputation over decades on the integrity of the author relationships it maintained, and that continuing to distribute a book under circumstances this compromised was not something their leadership was willing to do. What followed was a negotiation that took most of that Monday and continued through 2 follow-up calls over the next several days. Sandra was measured and precise throughout, never aggressive, always focused on the specific outcomes that mattered. By the end of the week, the publishing house had agreed to the core of what we were asking for. The book would be re-released under my name as sole author. All existing copies bearing Ethan's name would be recalled from distribution. The advance that had been paid to Ethan would be reclaimed by the publisher through their agreement with Marcus Fain's agency, and a new contract would be drawn up with me directly, including a revised advance and full royalty rights going forward. Marcus Fain's agency settled separately and quickly. Sandra had made clear in her communications with them that knowingly representing a work whose authorship was fraudulently presented exposed the agency to significant liability, and that the documentation made the knowing element difficult to dispute given the timeline of communications between Ethan and Marcus. The agency agreed to a settlement that included a formal acknowledgement that the submission had been made under false authorship and a payment that covered a portion of my legal costs. Ethan's attorney Douglas Pierce made one final attempt to negotiate a co-authorship credit as part of the settlement, arguing that Ethan's editorial contributions and role in bringing the book to publication warranted some formal recognition. Sandra declined on my behalf without hesitation. Ethan had not edited the manuscript in any meaningful way. He had forwarded it. Co-authorship credit for forwarding someone else's completed work was not something I was prepared to consider, and the documentation made pursuing that argument in court a losing proposition for Douglas regardless. The settlement was finalized on a Friday afternoon 3 months after Sandra had first sent the legal notice. I signed the new publishing contract the following week. The book was scheduled for re-release under my name within 60 days, with a revised cover, a new author bio, and an acknowledgments page I wrote myself in about 20 minutes, honest, specific, and containing the names of the 3 beta readers who had shown up for me when it mattered. What happened to Ethan after the settlement moved quickly and without any action on my part. The story had been public enough that the literary community had followed it closely, and the outcome was not ambiguous. Several publications that had run profiles of Ethan during the book's initial promotional period published follow-up pieces acknowledging the resolution of the dispute. His name became attached to the story in a way that made future professional relationships in publishing essentially impossible. Marcus Vane's agency quietly removed all mention of him from their website. 2 speaking engagements he had booked at literary festivals sent formal cancellations within days of the settlement becoming public. My parents called again after everything was finalized. This time my father spoke first. He said he was sorry for suggesting there was a middle ground when there wasn't one, and that he should have said clearly from the beginning that what Ethan had done was wrong. My mother cried quietly for part of the call and told me she was proud of how I had handled everything. I stayed on the phone with them for a long time that evening, longer than I had expected to, and by the end of it something that had been tight in my chest for months had loosened enough that I could feel the difference. Ethan sent me a letter by mail, handwritten, 4 pages. I read it once the evening it arrived and set it on my desk without responding. He said things I had needed to hear for a long time, and he said them without making excuses, which I hadn't expected. I wasn't ready to respond yet. But I didn't throw the letter away. The re-released book came out on a Tuesday in early spring, 63 days after the settlement was signed. The new cover was cleaner than the original, darker tones, a single image that captured the emotional center of the story in a way the first design hadn't quite managed. My name sat at the bottom in clean white type. Nicole Hartwell. I had looked at my name on documents my entire adult life and never once felt what I felt looking at it on that cover for the first time. The publisher's publicity team had prepared a carefully worded press release acknowledging the re-release and the authorship correction without going into legal specifics. They didn't need to go into specifics. The literary community had followed the story closely enough that the context was already widely understood. What the press release focused on instead was the book itself, the story, the writing, the reception it had received before everything fell apart, and the fact that its actual author was now in a position to speak about it publicly for the first time. The interview requests started arriving within hours of the announcement. Sandra and I had discussed this in advance and agreed that I would do a limited number of conversations focused entirely on the book and my experience writing it, not on Ethan or the legal process. I had no interest in performing anger for an audience or turning what had happened into something that defined me publicly in ways I couldn't control. What I wanted was to talk about the work, because the work was what had survived everything and the work was what I was proud of. The first interview I gave was to a literary magazine I had read since college. The journalist was thoughtful and prepared, and she spent most of our conversation asking about the book's origins, the 5 years of development, and the emotional experience of writing a psychological drama rooted in the specific kind of family dishonesty I had grown up watching from the inside. I answered everything honestly and at length because those were questions I had been waiting years to answer in a room where someone was genuinely listening. The piece ran the following week and was the most widely shared thing the magazine had published in months. The book began climbing again almost immediately after the re-release. Readers who had followed the dispute and felt a stake in the outcome bought copies in the first week at a rate the publisher hadn't projected. Book clubs that had been holding off pending the resolution of the authorship question scheduled it for their spring reading lists. A paperback edition was fast-tracked for the following season. By the end of the first month, the book had outsold its entire original run under Ethan's name. None of it felt like triumph in the way I might have imagined it would during the worst months of the legal process. What it felt like was relief, a specific, physical relief, the kind that only arrives after something that has been pressing against you for a long time finally moves. I had spent 5 years writing the book and nearly a year recovering it, and now it existed in the world the way it was supposed to exist, with my name on it, and my voice inside it, and no version of the story that required anyone to pretend otherwise. I thought about the night I had watched Ethan on television describing the emotional journey behind a story he had never lived. I thought about sitting in Sandra's office laying out a timeline I had been living inside for years. I thought about Priya's message arriving out of nowhere on the same day Ethan called to tell me I was being dramatic. Each of those moments had felt impossible in its own way, and all of them had led here, to a Tuesday morning in early spring, a clean dark cover, and my name where it had always belonged. Claire Sutton from the publishing house sent me a personal email the week the sales numbers came in. She said the book had found its audience the way books that are genuinely true to something always eventually do. She said she was glad the process had ended the way it had and that she hoped we would work together again. I wrote back and told her I was already working on something new. That was true. I had started the outline 3 weeks after the settlement was signed, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Portland with a cup of coffee and a blank document open on my screen. The first line had come quickly, the way first lines sometimes do when you have been carrying something around long enough that it finally knows how to introduce itself. The literary festival invitation arrived 6 weeks after the re-release. It was one of the larger annual events on the East Coast, held every spring in Charleston, South Carolina, drawing authors, editors, agents, and readers from across the country. I had attended once years earlier as a member of the public, sitting in the back of a crowded tent listening to writers I admired, thinking about the manuscript sitting unfinished on my laptop back in Portland. The invitation this time was to appear as a featured author on a panel about psychological fiction and family dynamics. I accepted without hesitating. The panel was held on Saturday afternoon in a large tent with seating for several hundred people. For the first 40 minutes, the conversation stayed with the craft, how each of us approached psychological tension, how we built characters whose interior lives felt real, how we decided what to withhold from the reader and when. I answered every question directly and felt the audience tracking with me in the way that only happens when something you are saying is landing somewhere real. Then a woman near the back raised her hand and asked me something no one had asked me directly in a public setting before. She said she had followed the story of the book from the beginning and wanted to know what the experience had taught me about the relationship between writing and ownership, not legal ownership, but the deeper kind. The sense in which a story belongs to the person who lived inside it long enough to find out what it needed to be. The tent went quiet in the way large spaces go quiet when everyone is paying attention at the same time. I told her that for a long time I had believed getting my name on the cover was the thing that mattered most. And all of that had mattered. But what I had learned was that ownership in the deeper sense had never actually been in question. No one had been able to take the experience of writing the book. No one had been able to take the 5 years of decisions, the drafts, the specific knowledge of why every scene existed and what it was trying to do. Ethan had taken the manuscript. He had not been able to take any of the things that made it what it was, because those things lived in me and only in me. The applause that followed was the kind that feels different from ordinary applause, slower, fuller, like it means something specific. After the panel, I signed books for nearly 2 hours. People told me they had read it twice. A few said they had bought copies for their sisters. One woman about my mother's age held my hand for a moment after I signed her copy and didn't say anything at all, just looked at me with an expression I understood without needing it explained. I was driving back to my hotel along the Charleston waterfront when my phone rang through the car speakers. It was Ethan. We hadn't spoken since the call where I told him Sandra would be in touch with his attorney, nearly 8 months ago. I answered. He asked how the festival had gone. I told him it had gone well. Then after a long silence, he said he had read the re-released book with my name on it, and that reading it knowing everything it had cost me made him understand what he had done in a way he hadn't before. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he was sorry in a way that sounded like it had taken him a long time to get there. I told him I had read his letter, that it had mattered, that I wasn't ready to talk about what came next, but that I was glad he had called. We stayed on the phone a few more minutes talking about nothing in particular, and then said goodnight the way siblings do when they are finding their way back to each other from a very long distance, carefully, one call at a time. The second book took 14 months to write. Not 5 years, 14 months, which told me something about what changes in a person when they stop carrying weight that was never theirs to carry. I worked faster, more decisive, less likely to second-guess a scene that was already doing what it needed to do. Fighting for the first book had clarified something about my relationship to the work. I no longer confused the difficulty of writing with doubt about whether it was worth doing. Sandra called 3 months into the new manuscript to confirm that everything had fully closed. Marcus Vane's agency had filed the formal acknowledgement of fraudulent submission with the relevant industry bodies, which in publishing carries consequences that don't require further action from anyone. 2 agencies Ethan had quietly approached about future representation declined after routine background checks. The door he had tried to walk through using my work had closed permanently behind him. The first book crossed 50,000 copies in its 8th month under my name. Claire Sutton sent a handwritten note that said the number felt right. I put it on my desk next to the outline of the second book and left it there. My parents flew to Portland that summer. On the last evening, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table after my mother had gone to bed and told me he had handled everything wrong from the beginning, that he had prioritized keeping the peace over acknowledging what was true. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. We sat at that table for another hour talking about things we had never quite gotten around to saying before. Ethan and I spoke more regularly as the months passed. The conversations were never entirely easy, and I didn't expect them to be. But they were real in a way they hadn't been for a long time. He was working in marketing again in Nashville and never once asked me to use my name in any professional context. That restraint meant something to me even if I never said so directly. The second book delivered on a Thursday morning in early autumn. I sent the file, closed my laptop, and sat for a while looking out at the street below where the leaves were just beginning to turn. None of the things that had been taken from me had stayed taken. The manuscript had been taken and returned. The credit had been taken and corrected. The time was simply gone, but what had grown in its place would not have existed without it. The second book came out the following spring. It did well. I was already working on the third.